historians in the world who specializes in British Industrial Revolution, first of all, but today he will talk about Russian Industrial Revolution, or Soviet Industrial Revolution, on which he wrote a book, and this book provides a very non-standard view on the Soviet Industrial Revolution, so I hope it will be interesting for the audience, and we will be
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to tell you about the book that I did and the project, and I hope it's provocative and we have a good discussion. This is, if you're interested, the book has just been actually issued in paperback, and you can get it on Amazon very quickly. But the book was published, must be 10 years ago at this point, that it appeared, and of course that meant that mostly I wrote it 15 years ago. And so if I can't remember some things, it's because it happened so far in the past, but I'll do my best. So I want to go through the main arguments of this and, well, see where it leads. So the book undertakes a reassessment of Soviet economic history. What institutions and policies worked, which failed, why, what lessons does Soviet history have to teach about economic development in general. I suppose I should say that I thought this was an interesting topic to pursue in the 1990s when I started it, because I was interested in, well, there was all sorts of postmortems being written on the Soviet Union and these kinds of questions, and I thought it would be interesting to try to do my own analysis. Secondly, it intrigued me as a research problem for three reasons. One was that it was quite clear that intersectoral linkages, shifting labor from agriculture to industry, was an important part of the process. And so that meant you need to have some kind of multi-sector model to analyze this. And I'd never done that, so that seemed like a good thing, a challenge to do. Also, there were huge numbers of volumes of detailed data that had been worked over by Western scholars and published, but they never really did very much with them. They'd do projections of growth rates of the U.S. and the Soviet Union into the future, but no real analysis about how anything worked. So I thought, well, there's these data that I could avail myself of, and that would help. And then the third thing, of course, was that Russia was a great, huge country with a great language, and so I'd have the excitement and challenge of learning Russian on top of learning how to do CGE models. So it made it all a very appealing project, as I'm sure you can imagine. And so I did start a 5-year plan to learn Russian, and I have to say it was as successful as many 5-year plans. It did achieve quite a lot, but it didn't achieve its maximal objectives by a long shot. So there we are. So the reassessment that I'm undertaking is based on three axes. One is repositioning of the debate on Soviet performance in a world historical context. Now, I say this because, as I said, when I started researching this, I found all of these large volumes of data with lots of data series on the Soviet economy written by Westerners. And they were almost always, the analysis was limited in the end to comparing projections of growth rates of the Soviet Union and the U.S. economies. And this was all, of course, done from a kind of an American perspective, with the Soviets going to overtake the United States. But the Soviets, at the same time, were always talking about catching up and overtaking the United States. So the whole issue of performance was seen in this juxtaposition of the Soviet Union versus the U.S. and where they were going. And it seems to me that's actually the wrong way to begin posing the questions about Soviet economic history. I think it's much more interesting, rather than to compare Soviet performance to less developed countries, which were the actual analogs of the Soviet Union in the beginning of the 20th century, rather than the most advanced country. And so when I say repositioning it, I'm thinking in terms of looking at Soviet performance vis-a-vis the performance of India or China or Latin America rather than the most advanced countries. Another axis of reorientation was recalculation of national income over the 1928 to 1940 period, in particular the growth of consumption. So this has been, measuring national income has been a big issue in this whole literature. And I have some new estimates which don't actually differ in terms very dramatically from those that Angus Madison uses in his work, but they are built on totaling up the various components of gross national expenditure, consumption and investment and so forth. And I have in the process spent a good deal of time on the consumption series because, as you may know, the evolution of consumption during the first 3 5-year plans from 1928 to 1940 has been a big issue of political and historical debate. So that was something I wanted to do. And then, of course, the third part of the assessment is based on using simulation models to explore historical and policy counterfactuals, like what was the effect of the investment strategy in collectivization and industrialization and living standards in the 1930s? What was the effect of famine, war, and fertility on population growth? These are, fundamental questions, and I think the only way you can really answer them is to propound a model that simulates reality history when you use the actual historical time paths of exogenous variables, and then allows you to vary parameters, the structure of the model, whatever, to see how things like investment strategy or collectivization of agriculture influence the development trajectory. So we try to do that, and you'll see some of those models and the results. So this inquiry, though, that did lead to a more favorable assessment of Soviet performance than is usually reached. So I want to say, though, that I'm not endorsing the Soviet system, and I think that dictatorship was a political model to be avoided, that collectivization and political repression were human catastrophes that brought meager economic returns, and that the strength of central planning, I do think it did have strengths, also contained the seeds of its own undoing, for it required a planner. And when plan objectives were misguided, as in the Brezhnev period, the system stagnated. I think I'll say some further things about failings of the system later that I think I see more clearly now, partly through comparisons with other economies like China. But at any rate, these are positions I still adhere to. So in this talk, I'll examine these 6 issues. I want to look at, as I say, Soviet growth in a world historical context. Then I want to look at growth in the late imperial period, then the standard of living in the period of 1928 to 1940, the period of the first 3 5-year plans, the classic Soviet Industrial Revolution. Then the causes of rapid growth in that period. I want to analyze Soviet demographic history, and then look at the Soviet growth slowdown. So part 1, Soviet growth in world historical perspective. So the main factors about economic growth include that income per head has gone up in almost all countries in the last 100, 200 years. Among the rich countries of the OECD, there's been a convergence of income as the poorer countries in the OECD have caught up and grown faster than the rich countries. Outside the OECD, however, the reverse is generally true. That is, the countries that were poor in 1800 or 1900 or whatever have grown less rapidly than the rich countries. And as a result, incomes have diverged around the world. So this is a graph that shows some of these features and shows them over a very long period. This divergence I'm talking about has occurred mainly since 1500. In 1500, the richest parts of the world were perhaps 50%, had per capita income perhaps 50% higher than the poorest parts of the world. So the differential was comparatively small. By the time you get to the Industrial Revolution in 1800, the leading economies, which include Britain, which is having the Industrial Revolution, are maybe 4 times richer than the poorest countries in the world. And this divergence in income is the result of the success of these countries like Britain and the Netherlands and creating commercial empires in this period, and then the advent of industrial technology in Britain. Since then, the gaps have exploded, and now the ratio of the richest to the poorest groups of countries is on the order of 20 to 1 in per capita income. And mostly the countries that are up here at the top were the ones that were in the ascendancy here. So this is the UK, which was the leader here, and it's way up here. And most of the countries down here, like India, stayed down here. There are a few exceptions to the pattern, and the green line is Japan, which starts off as a very poor country and does catch up to the richest countries. But there are exceptions, are few and far between, but there are some. So what we kind of want to know is where Russia and the Soviet Union fit into this kind of pattern. And so by most indicators, 19th century Russia was among the poor countries. Its income per head, as it's usually measured, was on the low end, not the high end. It had a very large share of its workforce in agriculture, which was characteristic of the poor countries. It had a very high fertility demographic system, total fertility rate of women being about 7 children per woman. That's also characteristic of poor countries at that time. And the institutional structures were characteristic of those of poorer countries, the capriciousness of the legal system and the authoritarianism of the state. So, if you accept that Russia's in the group in the late 19th century is in the group of poor countries, not the group of rich countries, your kind of normal prediction would be that Russia would remain poor throughout the 20th century. That's not really what happened. The remarkable feature of the Soviet period is that Russia bucked the trend. In the 20th century, Japan was the most successful economy. I showed you on the graph the green line of the Japanese going from the bottom up to the top. So that was really remarkable. That was the most successful economy of the 20th century. It was one of the few countries, poor countries, that became rich. But the USSR was perhaps the second most successful poor country. And now, recently, it's certainly been overtaken by South Korea and Taiwan, which have joined the club. So there's some other East Asian economies that are remarkable and having very rapid growth. But the Soviet Union is one of the ones that's in this group that broke the general pattern of poor countries that became.
What about the whole Eastern Europe? Countries like Austria or Hungary, they were very similar to Russian economy. They choose completely different path than Austria, and not the richest now.
Yeah, well, all right, let me carry on with this. If we look at this graphically, we see that we see several. So we have a graph here on the horizontal axis. We have GDP per head in 1928 in 1990 US dollars. So the further to the right you are, the richer the country is then. And then this is the growth factor between 1928 and 1970. It shows the number of times that per capita income has increased. And the black dots along here are OECD countries, and there's a downward line, regression line through those points, which is the OECD catch-up regression. So this means that OECD countries like these out here that had high per capita incomes in 1928, they didn't grow so fast. Their per capita incomes go up about 2.5 times, whereas poorer ones down here have larger increases in per capita income, so they catch up to the rich countries, right? And that pattern's represented here. Most of the rest of the world, Japan is way up there. That's the most successful country, right? The Soviet Union is here. That's above the OECD catch-up line. So that's why I say that successful performance. I don't know which point is Austria, but it's probably one of the ones here too, I think. That. But most of these points here, and certainly most of the countries with incomes like this, are all down here. So they have low incomes and low growth factors, so they fall behind. They don't catch up, right? And there's a few countries over here too, like these are the southern cone of Latin America, that had quite high incomes in 1928, didn't grow very fast, and have fallen behind.
Sorry, the graph, the graph will be more or less the same for like 1930, because 28 is like 8 years into Soviet rule. So part of the fact that the USSR is to the left is already a result of the Soviet Union. So what would you look at pre-Soviet, like 1930?
It would be similar to this. I don't think there's any big difference.
So there's no fall in GDP per capita because of, like, is it 20?
Yeah, well, it goes down and it does go back. So 1928 is sort of what catch-up is done. Also, I mean, the other thing about it, there's the First World War, too. Right? So the economic histories of all sorts of countries have been deranged by the First World War. So the question is, why did the Soviet Union perform so much better than so many of these poor countries? All right. But before we tackle that period, I want to look at the late imperial period in the end of 1913 and talk about what was the growth situation then, and then we can sort of see how that relates to what happens later. In this period, 1870 to 1913, per capita income rose in many countries, including Russia. And so the key questions are what caused this economic growth? A big counterfactual question is, would the growth have continued in the 20th century? Would Russia have caught up to the West if the communist period had never happened? And then, did the pattern of growth play a role in the revolutions of 1905 and 1917? So, in this period, 1870 to the First World War, Russia followed what I call the standard model of economic development in the 19th century. So the standard model was a development strategy that was followed by many countries that grew successfully in this period, like the United States, like Germany, most of the Western European countries. And it involved four features. Four kind of policy initiatives. One was creating a large national internal market. Many countries, this meant abolishing various kinds of internal tariffs and so forth, legal issues. But beyond that, it involved building infrastructure. And so Imperial Russia did a lot of that. They built 71,000 kilometers of railway, so creating a national market. The second thing was using tariffs to protect domestic industries from British competition. And Imperial Russia certainly did that. They had a high tariff regime on all kinds of manufactured goods. They used differential rates of tariff to promote both cotton manufacture in Russia and cotton growing in Central Asia. Procurement policies for railway building channeled railway orders to Russian firms. So they did that. They also, a third part of the standard model was creating a financial system. And so that normally meant creating banks, investment banks, and a central bank to manage the currency and so forth. So Russia did that. Also, Russia, along with other countries that started industrializing at the same time, countries like Mexico, for instance, do innovate around the financial aspects of the standard model by going for foreign borrowing to a much greater degree than other countries have done in the past. So 20% of the capital formation in Russia in the late 19th century is financed abroad, and foreign investment is a kind of a vehicle for importing technology into the country. Yeah.
I thought tariffs were overall low for Russia. It's just high for certain industries, right? So unlike the United States, the U.S. is a big jump in average tariffs following the beginning of the Civil War, which lasted several decades. Russia follows the European pattern of having declining average tariffs from about the 1860s onwards.
Well, but they're high enough, and it's tariffs, and there's all these procurement things. I think compared to, it's not a free trade country.
But relatively, in the sense that if you look at the change, most of Europe, particularly post the Anglo-French Treaty of Commerce, is lowering their average tariff substantially. So you see a general pattern. The U.S. is the only one that breaks that pattern thanks to the Civil War. So most of the other countries, you get some ambiguity on what you measure, but the direction, the first order, the first derivative is negative. That is, tariffs are going down. Tariffs are going up in the United States.
Yeah, but they're still high.
Russia, only in certain sectors. If you look at average, it's lower.
Well, finally, the fourth part of the general standard model is educating the population. And Imperial Russia starts doing that, and literacy rates are rising in Russia. So there's considerable activity that takes place within this kind of policy framework, which is a policy framework that's associated with closing the gap in the United States and Germany catching up to Britain. Another feature, though, so that's what's going on. However, most of that's irrelevant to much of the growth in income that takes place. There is a growth in income in Russia, but most of it's caused by the growth of agriculture, and most of that's a response to changes in the terms of trade. In particular, from the mid-1890s onward, the world price of agricultural products rises relative to the price of industrial products. And this induces an expansion of agricultural production in Russia, both in the central parts of Russia and in Siberia and more remote areas. And building all the railroads out there brings them, is complementary to this, brings them into contact with the world market. So that if we were to look at national income originating by sectors in Russia in 1885 and 1913, well, you can see, first of all, there's a big increase in national income from 8,594 to 2,292, so it goes up about 2.5 times. But just arithmetically, almost half of that is increased value added in agriculture. So this is the expansion of production in response to the higher prices. And then if you work through, I'm not going to go through this sort of in detail, but a lot of these changes in the other sectors are clearly related to that. The increase in transportation value added is a lot related to shipping the grain out of the country and so forth. So then I think it's fair to say that a considerable fraction of the growth in output in Russia at this time has to do with an agricultural expansion in response to rising prices. There is the policy of promoting industries has some payoff in the sense that there is numerically a big tenfold increase in the output of heavy industry. But it starts from such a small base that it doesn't dominate what's happening in the economy, and the total increase is not a very big proportion of the whole overall increase in national income. So that is in itself the main manifestation of this tariff-promoted industrialization. So would Russian growth have continued in the 20th century and closed the gap with the West? Well, as I say, we've noticed that one country did that, Japan, and Russian growth would have had to be at the top of the world league table for the 20th century to have caught up, which in itself is a kind of intrinsically unlikely event. But it seems to me that it's further unlikely for structural reasons, that the factors that underlay the expansion of the economy in the late medieval or late imperial period didn't continue. In particular, much of the growth in agriculture then was due to the rise in the world price of wheat. Well, after the First World War, wheat prices collapse and fall throughout the 1930s. So that kind of engine of expansion would have stopped turning. There weren't really any more railways to build, at least that would have been profitable. And there are many cases where we can, as it were, look at history to see experiments in this. So other countries that grew substantially and rapidly in the late 19th century by exporting wheat, like Argentina, go into decline and stagnation for most of the 20th century in response to the change in these kind of variables. So it seems to me, based on their experience, it's unlikely that Russia would have continued to develop on the basis of the imperial economy. Only somehow by changing those bases would growth have continued in a rapid rate. One of the things, so some of you are students, so one of the things that occurred to me as I was working on all of this was that it would be a good thing to make up a CGE model of the imperial Russian economy and then see if you could replicate its behavior and then use it to simulate what would have happened had, for instance, happened in the rest of the 20th century, given what actually happened to the world price of wheat. And I thought of that too late in this project to do it myself, but I commend it to you as a worthy challenge. Another feature of this is that the Russian economic growth was not fast enough to benefit all Russians, that real wages stagnated and extra income accrued to land and capital. Western Europe growth was fast enough to raise wages, giving workers a stake in the system, and this underlaid their conversion to social democracy. But in Russia and other peripheral parts of Europe, like Spain, growth was not rapid enough to benefit workers, and the polity cracked. So this is some data that shows you trends in real wages for various modern railroad, factory, building workers. Their series are pretty flat, whereas at the same time, output per worker is increasing by a factor of 2.4 in industry. So there's rising labor productivity, but flat real wages, so income is shifting against workers. In the countryside, real wages for agricultural laborers are pretty flat over the last part of this period, whereas by my calculations, real earnings per peasant family are rising. So that means, from the terms of factors of production, that labor income is not rising, but return to land is rising. And so this means this is why land ownership becomes increasingly valuable. And land ownership and how it's organized, of course, is the big political issue in the countryside in the early 20th century.
So isn't that the issue you have to talk about for the counterfactual post-1913? Because the big issue holding down agricultural wages are the structural constraints of the system, which don't allow a lot of movement out of agriculture and industry. That's explicitly a constraint on, say, the Russian ministers from, say, Count Witte. And the Stolypin reforms would have allowed much more movement from agriculture and industry, which presumably would have benefited agricultural workers. And so there is a big institutional change in the decade just prior to World War I. So the real issue is that, do we observe what the kind of internal opening of the agricultural market might have done? I mean, so doing CG terms, you can't assume that the period post-1905 is the same structurally as the, say, 1850 to 1905 period. Right? Isn't that part of the story?
You can make up a CG model and show that. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ongoing, lots of questions that we can research further. I agree. I'm not convinced that would have had a big impact, but perhaps it would have. Other people will figure this out. Okay. So in summary then, on this aspect, it seems to me that Tsarist development was a kind of one-off natural resource boom souped up with some tariff-induced industrialization, and that the wheat boom would not have continued throughout the 20th century. Further regrowth required radical changes of some sort, and whether abolishing the commune was sufficient, I'm not sure. At any rate, growth was feeble enough that labor markets were slack, and rising inequality and disputes about the ownership of land, I think, underpinned at least radical politics and political instability. I won't go so far as to say they caused revolutions, which I think is a whole other question, but they think they caused instability. So now I want to move forward and talk about the Soviet period. So just a few sort of standard dates I just put on the slide. Like there's the revolution in 1917, the period of war communism from 1917 to 21, and the new economic policy from 1921 to 28, and then the period of 5-year plans starting in 1928 with a big push towards industrialization. So some of these things are of some importance in what I want to say, and some importance in historical debates, and some are less so. The new economic policy is the subject of considerable debate. So the new economic policy was a system of organization in which most of the industry was nationalized. Agricultural land was owned by village communes, and peasants had their own farms within the communal system. And there were sort of market relations between town and country. And so in a sense, you can imagine, so that's one thing. One of the big things that happens when planning is introduced, although it's not the same thing as planning, is that agriculture is also collectivized, so that the system of communes is replaced by, and individual farms is replaced by collective farms. So there is a big question about whether or not economic growth could have continued or accelerated within the system of the new economic policy, that is, without collectivization. There's all of these kind of grand counterfactuals in Russian history. Could the pre-revolutionary economy have grown rapidly or not, or some reformed version grown rapidly? But then after 1917, could an economy kind of like the new economic policy, which was less dirigist and overtly oppressive, could that have generated rapid growth or not? Or did the full-blown Soviet system of planning plus collectivized agriculture, is that really necessary for the growth that took place? So we kind of want to know those answers to those questions by the time we get done. So first I want to say something about this. So I want to say I'm going to go through a number of issues about the period 1928 to 1940. These are the periods of the first 3 5-year plans, starting the plans to the Second World War. So what's happening then? So one of the issues that's been greatly debated is what happened to consumption over this period. And this is partly a national income accounting question in a technical sense. And it also gets into all of these questions about the impact of collectivization on living standards and the priorities of the regime and the concentration, the building up of the capital stock and the concentration of investment on heavy industry. Was this all at the expense of consumption or not? And there's different indicators that we can look at. And my impression is that they all show an increase in consumption over this period. Now this conclusion is sort of... Well, yeah.
I think it's obviously missed from this slide. Mortality rate and
I put it in another slide. I don't mean... Yes, I agree. Even setting aside the famine and collectivization, if you read a book like Abram Bergson's book on national income in the Soviet Union, he computes changes in consumption. In the main part of the book, it has per capita consumption going down between 1928 and the end of the 1930s. Right? Just comparing the beginning and end points, right? So these, I'm suggesting that actually, if you compare the beginning and the end points, it goes up, it doesn't go down. That's what my conclusion's going to be. Along the way, it's not smooth. That's all right. So if, for instance, these are estimates of calorie consumption per capita that I made up from Russian and Imperial Russian, and then Soviet, sort of reworked Soviet sources. And these are, and then they link up with FAO estimates for the end of the Soviet period. So the UN Food and Agricultural Organization works this number out for every country in the world. Okay, and basically what they do is they look at the production of food, of all the various food products, mostly agricultural products, but they introduced some kind of, manufactured products like alcohol and beer. They use statistics on those. They basically get production, and then they subtract exports and add imports, and then they make allowances for some conversion, losses of nutrients and conversion in baking bread and from wheat and such like, and also losses in storage, transportation losses, and losses, just general wastage in the system. And so I took all those assumptions and applied them to these earlier data. And so if you do that, you get a pattern like this, which shows, if we look here, in the late sort of 1928, 29, the per capita calorie consumption works out to be like 2,400 calories per person per day. It crashes down here in this collectivization famine to the average is about 2,000 per person per day. But then it goes back up by the end of the 1930s as agriculture recovers, and then it continues up there into the 1990s. One thing, these figures are from imperial statistics, right, and they're very low, and I showed them to you, I don't entirely know what to make of them, but an average calorie consumption of 1,800 calories a day. The FAO figures show that for countries like Indonesia or India in the 1960s, so maybe they're not impossible, but they're certainly very low.
Did you do a trend analysis?
No.
Because I'm just eyeballing that, but it looks like there's a break in trend. So if you even take into account volatility, it looks like you have a lower trend post-1930. And that would be consistent with, because remember, the Russian statistics show growth through 1917, and you have a big drop between 1917 and 1920s. Yeah. So you could make the argument that the 1905-13 period is the structure, one-time shift, which would lead to a higher overall rate, and then they're breaking that after 1920. I mean, that's one way. That's what would be required if you run a CG. That's what you have to debate as to whether you want to treat pre-1905 the same, or you want to treat 1905-1913 as a different trend. So if you use a trend analysis, you can get that.
Well, yeah, or these early data that are giving you the trend are just wrong. Which, I mean, they're incredibly low numbers, so I don't know.
It's possible that if you calculate per adult, it might be much higher, the consumption.
Oh, yeah, I mean, this is just over everybody, right? So you have to, when you think about what a norm is, you have to have in mind different.
As I know, in Imperial Russia, it was like completely different demographic situation.
So you have more children.
They have like much more.
Yeah. So that's a good point.
Yeah, and children do not need so many calories.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So maybe that's I didn't do that. See, there's lots of research projects for you all to write PhD dissertations on. So another approach to measuring living standards that's becoming common is anthropometrics. And there are estimates from life tables that show increases in life expectancy for men and women over the period. And also the heights of soldiers recruited in the imperial armies, and then the Red Army in the late 1940s show an increase of about 5 centimeters in height, which is quite a lot for height. So I give you that. I made up estimates based on production data series of consumption per head, which have this pattern here. And you see, like, they start here, they crash down here. Collectivization of agriculture is happening here. There's a famine here. This is right. There's a big fall in consumption. And then they go back up here like that, reaching a higher point in the late 30s than they started with. I was very pleased to discover that there's another book by Hunter and Shermer on this Soviet economy in this period, and they redo national income on their own way with their own kind of weights, and it's quite a different procedure than what I followed. They don't actually publish a total production, a total consumption per head. They do it by rural and urban and so forth, but if you combine the data and work it out, you get this graph which is shown there, which is virtually the same as the one that I did. So I thought that was really it either shows that we're all just using the same data, and so we're bound to get the same answer. But I don't think so, because they certainly weight their data differently and treat it differently. So I don't know. But at least it corroborates the story I'm giving you. And so you can say, well, where did this all come from? Who realized this? And one reason for asking that is if you look at real wages over this period, they don't seem to show the same story. So when doing real wages, there's a big issue about the years that you use, because in many years in this period, the prices don't tell you the scarcity values of goods because there are shortages and so forth. So the most reliable way to do it, I think, is to compare 1927-28, which is the beginning of the planning period, and then 1937, which was after a price reform, and at least according to Bergson, the markets, the prices reflect market clearing prices. So if you do that, then you can use at least fairly orthodox procedures and compare, take earnings and divide them by a price index, a conventional price index, and measure real earnings. So if you do that, it's 87%. It looks like overall real earnings fall. So how can I have per capita consumption going up and real wages falling? And indeed, if you look at, if you go through all of these urban jobs here, it looks like real wages are falling in all of them, right? But I think that what's going on is that there's a huge movement of people from the countryside to the city, and that the wage levels in all of these urban occupations are much higher than the rural earnings. Even the cost of living is higher in the cities too, and you can build that into the calculation. But even allowing for that, what you find is that it's numbers like this, that real wages for people that left the country and moved to the city and had a job there were much higher. They had the big increase. So it's the sectoral shifts that are related to the rises. And people who make the sectoral shifts, whom there are quite a few, get increased consumption. And that's how you reconcile the real wages and the consumption data. So, okay, how did they have rising consumption and rising investment at the same time? My view about this begins with agriculture, because I see the Soviet Union in the 1920s as kind of classic surplus labor economy. And it's mobilizing surplus labor that allows production to rise very rapidly and increase both consumption and investment at the same time. And my reason for thinking that the Soviet Union in the 1920s was a labor surplus economy comes from comparing European Russian agriculture with the Canadian prairies and the U.S. northern plains states. So there is a literature that compares the efficiency of Soviet and American agriculture. And if you just look at sort of like an average, national average of the yield of wheat in the two countries, it's very misleading, because basically the United States has a better climate for most agricultural activities than Russia does. And so if you want to remove the effect of climate, you have to compare geographically similar regions with the same climate. And so the sort of standard comparison group for European Russia anyway are the Canadian provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and the states, the U.S. states of Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and sometimes Nebraska. So I tried to match up data for these in the 1920s, and indeed at other times, to see how agriculture compared. And it's like this. You get differences, the result depends on the indicator you use. If you look at biological measures of efficiency, like grain yields, like the number of kilograms per hectare grain that's harvested, there's very little difference between these north-central North American, center part of North America and Russia. But if you look at employment in agriculture or output per worker in agriculture, there's a big difference. So the big difference reflects the fact that farms are much larger in North America than they are in Russia. So this will show you, this for instance is a time series of wheat yields for European Russia, and the state of North Dakota, which makes for a particularly appealing graph. And basically you see they're pretty flat here, right? From the late 1890s up until the Second World War. Then they go up together in both places, right? And the reason that they go up together in both places is improvements in seed and the use of fertilizer. That's the same kind of technological package. But there's no big difference here in grain yields here. It is interesting, and this bears on this question of what you make of the late imperial period, but the yields are higher in North America than they are in Russia at this time. And the yields go down in North America, right? It must be the North American reflex to the Stolypin reforms, right? Or it has to do with rainfall in the Canadian prairies. But these numbers, I have to say, when you back into here into the 1890s, many of these years are just incredibly low, so it does begin to wonder how accurate those data are. But anyhow. So that's sort of, I can give you lots more examples of that, but that shows how one example of the evidence that shows that the biological indicators are similar. The biggest difference, however, is that the average American farm was 84 hectares, while the average Russian farm was 11 hectares. And partly this is a question of mechanization. So the American farmers did it with machines. But even without mechanization, the Russian farm labor force was larger than was necessary to cultivate all the land. So this suggests to me that Russia was a classic labor surplus economy, and that means that the development problem was increasing the capital stock to provide jobs for everyone. So if you look at this in production possibility frontier terms, it's like this, that you start off here, say, in 1928, and Russia is at a point like that, inside its production possibility frontier. Labor moves to is employed in industry, producing producer goods, and they could be employed, these are consumer goods, these are producer goods that could be used for investment. In the models I'm going to talk about, they also get used for military equipment and a few other things. Most of the labor, the allocation of the labor is tilted this way towards the producer goods. That means that over time, the curve shifts up more rapidly, and you rise like that. So in my view of Soviet development, there's kind of two stages. One is going from here to here, where the labor force becomes fully employed, but then over time, the frontier shifts as capital is accumulated. And of course, the way I've drawn it here, most of the increase in the economy has been on the producer goods side, which is what happened, but there's also been an increase on the consumer good axis too. So the whole strategy was tilted towards the producer goods side, but it wasn't 100% towards the producer goods side. And that's what the data on rising consumption indicate. So I think I've said all of that. The movement of labor from farm to factory was the motor of Soviet growth. That's where the title of the book came from. Okay, so that's just kind of picture of what might happen. So what I wanted to do was try to see whether we could put numbers on this and actually do calculations. So this got to be the monstrously exciting task of making up a three-sector model of the Soviet economy. The idea was to track population and accumulate capital from one year to the next, and then see how the economy changed. And so I drew a diagram, which at the time I thought was transparent and obvious. 10 years later, I look at it and say, what was I thinking when I did that? But my editor said, maybe you should rethink that diagram. I think my editor was right. But let me try to explain. We've got, in my view of my attempt to model what's going on, in the end I had three sectors. So there's agriculture, consumer goods, and producer goods. Actually, agriculture is agriculture. Producer goods are the products of producer goods are investment goods or military equipment or hospital equipment. Investment in military equipment are the most important. And that's fairly tightly defined. In consumer goods is actually everything else that's not a producer good or agriculture, so it includes all sorts of services as well as goods normally considered. There's a production function for each of these kinds of producer goods and consumer goods. And those are CES functions that are calibrated with from Weitzman's production function estimates of the Soviet Union later. And then producer goods depends on the labor force and the capital stock there. Consumer goods depends on the capital stock and the labor force there, plus agricultural goods that are processed. And then agricultural output is treated as exogenous. So the argument is, A, that there's no point trying to relate it to the labor force in the countryside because there's excess labor. And secondly, that there's all these political events like collectivization that are having a huge impact on agriculture. So they're all outside the model in a sense. I mean, they're not endogenous to these narrow processes.
The whole sector of small craft industry is missed in this picture, and I think it's really very important in the case of both of the Russian Empire and of the reality of the Soviet 20s. And it's also important for the question of this whether the surplus of labor really exists in the countryside or not, because it's a question of how you measure the surplus. I guess you just take the population figure for measuring labor input in the agricultural sector. And the whole central industrial region was involved in all this craftsman industry. And this industry is completely missed in your simulation model, and I think it was quite big, about 10% or something, maybe even larger.
I think I do have their output in here. You don't think I have the output in there? There's more work to be done there, all right? But I don't remember. We can talk about it later. I want to say just so that there's various equations for this. What happens over time in the simulations? It goes from one year to the next. And so the labor force increases from one year to the next given population growth and movement between country and city. And then it's allocated between urban population, urban employment's allocated between consumer and producer goods. Capital stocks change depending on how much investment takes place and then how the investment's allocated. So it can be allocated in the first instance. Producer goods output can either be allocated towards the military or towards investment. So that's one set of decisions. And then investment can be allocated in different proportions. It's a policy variable between going into the producer goods or the consumer goods sector. And that affects growth rates over time. There's a number of markets in here. I'm not going to go through and try to explain these, but there's a number of markets that through which wage income is used to purchase goods both at subsidized official prices and then at free market prices. There's a free market for the collective farm market, which is excess production beyond planned quotas that's sold directly to urban consumers. So there's a certain amount of market activity there. There's a certain amount of administrative activity involved in the allocation, for instance, of investment between the two sectors, right? And depending on how all that works out, the future unfolds. Also, I made up various versions of this model, one for the collectivized economy, which actually existed, and then I wanted to say, what happens if there was no collectivization? So we had the same investment policy being pursued within the context of the NEP economy. Well, you don't go from the collectivized economy to the NEP economy by shifting one parameter. There's various things that happen, including no famine with collectivization, different migration function, slower rate of rural-urban migration. There's a half a dozen different things that change, right? So the thing had to be kind of all redone for that. And also there was yet another version of the model, depending on whether you had hard budget constraints or soft budget constraints. So a model with, so in real life, there were soft budget constraints, and I just allowed urban firms to increase employment to equal the urban labor supply. People were paid a wage of 3,1937 rubles a year, which was the average wage, but that meant in the context of this model that the marginal product of labor in industry was about 1,500 rubles a year. So there was a big gap that emerged because of this full employment policy. That's what soft budget constraints mean in my model. Hard budget constraints meant that I treated the urban labor market like a Harris-Todaro urban economy with this wage set at 3,000 rubles a year, and then firms hired labor up until the value of the marginal product was 3,000 rubles, and that cut urban employment, meant there was urban unemployment, which then factored into the migration decisions. So these are the kinds of issues that are involved. I was going to give you an example of how I figured out agricultural marketing, but I'm going to run out of time. So my actual and predicted and actual values are really good, though, for the 1920s. So I made up a little sub-assembly for marketing, tested it there, and I put it into this model for the 28 to 40 period. So when I had them on, so then there were these tests that were done. So, this was a kind of amazing experience trying to make this model, because it wasn't like I wrote down a set of equations and then estimated them from one set of data, and that was that, and there wasn't a set of data to estimate them from. So it was a question of working on parts of the model, calibrating them with the data that was available, and then putting them together. And so you make up a sort of sub-assembly like farm marketing. And from the point of view, so we want to know if X amount of farm output is produced, how much is marketed. And so there's some data I have on production, consumption by peasants, and then marketing, and prices that they're getting for these things. And based on those prices, I could estimate a utility function, parameterize a utility function that generated that output. So in that exercise, the prices are exogenous, and we see whether we can replicate marketing. So you get various of these sub-assemblies, but then some of these things like the prices become endogenous when you put various parts of the economy together. So I would sit at my computer and work out one assembly and then stick it into what the model was already there. So endogenizing some more of the variables and then trying to re-simulate it. And I remember doing these simulations on a TSP, which was an old statistical package. And it had a simulation procedure. And I had this base model in mind which had 30 endogenous variables. And I started out in the morning with these sub-assemblies, a model that had 15 endogenous variables. And then I added another section to the model and endogenized a few more. So I had a model with 18 endogenous variables. I simulated it, and all these variables tracked. So that was great. So I added another sub-assembly, right? And I had 24 endogenous variables, and it all tracked. And I got up to one with 28 endogenous variables. That was working fine. And two more variables to endogenize. I stuck in that sub-assembly and it crashed. It wouldn't work. It was terrible. I spent a very agonizing day thinking that several years of work were never going to go anywhere until I managed to imagine how I could change the structure so I could get around this and have actually solve the model. That involved a lot more programming. At any rate, once the whole thing, so the validity of the whole exercise then is this, there's a question, so you make up this big model, do you believe it? All right, so here's what what convinced me that I believed it was this, that if I took the model and simulated Soviet history with the actual historical trajectories of all of the exogenous variables over 1928 to 1940, and actually simulated all of the main endogenous variables pretty well. You have to do all of them, right? I discovered early on that it's very easy to rig your model to just say, track GDP, but all the other variables are going crazy. Right? So you have to actually be able to track all the endogenous variables reasonably, perfectly in the ideal case. So I did all of these tests, and I was convinced that it looked pretty good. So that meant that I thought the model was okay. So then once I had the model, then I could start simulating it and testing out different scenarios here. So this is the kind of thing. So we want to know, why did GDP go up during the planning period, the first 3 5-year plans? So in 1928, actual GDP is 200.9 million rubles, 1937 rubles, right? 1939, the end is 344.9. So that's the actual change that happens. Okay, so we want to know which of the various things that have gone on: collectivization of agriculture, change in the investment strategy, hard budgets, soft budgets, how do they, what accounts for it? So basically we can look at it like this. We've got 3 columns. One is the collectivized soft budget model. So agriculture is collectivized. There are soft budgets. So this corresponds to actual Soviet institutions. Then we've got the NEP economy. So agriculture is not collectivized, right? But we've got soft budgets in industry. Okay, so the industrial sector is like the real Soviet industrial sector, but agriculture's like the NEP. And then we've got the furthest removed one, which is where we've got this hard budget constraints, this kind of Harris-Todaro capitalist labor market in the cities, all right? But still, there's planned investment. All right, so we want to say what do those matter? And we've got here different rows. Now these are different values of a parameter E in the model, which is the fraction of producer goods output that's assigned, the fraction of investment that's assigned to heavy industry. All right, so 0.07 means 7% of investment goes to heavy industry, 93% goes to consumer goods industries. And this was about the value of that parameter at the pre-planning, was about 7%. And it rises to like 23%. That's how high it gets. So the Soviet investment strategy of emphasizing heavy industry means E is 0.23 instead of 0.07. So, okay, so we start off here looking at this table with the institutions that are least like the Soviet Union. So we say, suppose we had capitalist employment relations, hard budgets. Okay, if we simulate the economy with a pre-1928 investment allocation, it would start at 200 and end up at 240 in 1939. So there'd be a small amount of growth, but not very much, and way less than 344, right? But now suppose we increase the investment allocation, shift the investment allocation to heavy industry. That increases terminal GDP, in this case, to 290. All right, but that's so that shows you the impact of the increase of the investment strategy on the terminal level of GDP, going from 240 to 290. It's a bit different if you go down these other columns, but not dramatically different. So I don't think it matters the order in which we do this too much. But so we see that 290 is still a lot less than 340. Suppose then that we relax the hard budget constraints. We go to soft budgets. So that means, so in this case with hard budgets, it means there's lots of unemployment in the cities because you can't get jobs, right? Because firms cut off employment if the marginal product of labor is less than 3,000. Suppose we just let everybody who wants a job have a job and subsidize industry till that happens. Then GDP jumps up to 348.3. So that's actually just about what it actually was. Then suppose we say, okay, we rerun the experiment, but we collectivize agriculture in addition to having soft budget constraints. That would give us a terminal GDP of 364, which is only a little bit above 348. So my take on this is that the two things that, so when we get up here, like we basically simulated what actually happened, all right? So we have a complete explanation of economic growth. We start off with the initial things that we can put in these factors, and we end up with a terminal value. And if we look at these things, the things that matter most are the shift of investment from light industry to heavy industry, which goes from 240 to 290, and then soft budget constraints, which put people to work who would otherwise be unemployed, which gets you to 348. But then collectivizing agriculture increases terminal GDP a little bit, but not very much. And so I think that shows that there's huge human costs to collectivizing agriculture and virtually no economic payoff. Okay.
So your model actually
I'm not a Stalinist, but well, the model shows. I mean, if you believe the model, right? I mean, that these. Well, I think the shifting, the building up heavy industry caused growth. In a sense, that's not very surprising, right? Building up heavy industry meant you had rapidly increased the capital stock, and that's important. The soft budget constraints and the conditions of a labor surplus economy seem to me to make sense. Yes. Yes.
Actually, do we believe the model? The first question is about collective soft budget and net soft budget. The first difference between the main cause of collectivization was 6 million deaths.
Yes.
So here you have everything in per capita terms, don't you? So
No, these are totals. This is 344 million.
Okay, then to more, I think to one of the very important issue in your simulation. I mean this craft industry, because here this craft industry doesn't exist in your simulation and doesn't produce anything. This is more or less a reasonable assumption if you talk about the real Soviet path, because basically craft industry was destroyed. But in the capitalist employment hard budget alternative, it definitely produced something. And how much, it's an open question. So that's why.
I see. Well, that's a good point.
So
I take the point. All right. That's good.
So I think there's two separate parts of your model, and you can clearly believe that your model picks up the relative effect of heavy industry investment, and also your other work on in terms of shifting from the countryside to urbanization. Then the issue is what's the fact you want to explain, and my concern is that if you're using the 1939 actual, that one could argue it's wartime already, wartime industry in some sense, and that estimates of GDP are exaggerated. In the same way that work on U.S. GDP numbers for World War II has increasingly devalued the so-called gigantic, there's evidence about kind of the big jump in American GDP during World War II, but work which corrects for a large number of wartime price controls and various other kinds of things tend to suggest, I think all the work I've seen tends to downplay those numbers. People disagree about how much, but it tends to sort of say actual corrected GDP, sort of to get it on the same trend as the 1930s, sort of on the same types of measurements, give you lower numbers. If we would argue that there's some kind of correction for that to the Soviet Union, then perhaps for the late 30s, which are already periods of heavy militarization, then the end point is quite wrong. So, for instance, I can believe you get this big 240 to 290 jump. But what about if we sort of say, if we say the actual GDP corrected, or say wartime military expenditures, say 300, then what happens? I mean, do you believe GDP numbers in 1939 are not, in some sense, contaminated by the huge amount of military spending?
Well, it's part of GDP, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that combined with the way prices are calculated, you're not getting full market prices. So are we getting the correct measure of GDP?
Well, I mean, that's a big issue in itself, and I don't know. I'm reasonably confident in these, but I mean, we're all hostages to fortune to the GDP manufacturing industry. I don't see that as a big issue, but I think I have to. When do I have to stop? Now. 5 minutes. Oh. All right. Well, I think I've said most of what I want to say. I've done the same kind of exercise for, say, per capita consumption, and so I mean that's not contaminated in the same way by this, and you get basically the same answer. So perhaps somewhat surprisingly, or not, the increase in allocation of investment to heavy industry is not entirely at the expense of increasing consumption, although there is some there, but we do have a considerable increase in consumption over the whole period, and even an increase as we increase the fraction of investment goods going to heavy industry. But so I'll just end with this one graph, and which contrasts different, shows you annually different simulations from these structures. So the little round dots, which go like this, are the actual history of GDP. At least this is Madison's version of the history of GDP. The squares are what happens if you simulate the collectivized model with the historical trajectories of the exogenous variables. So it's supposed to replicate history. And it does pretty well in the sense it goes up like this, following up like that. So that's one of the tests, but only on one variable for the accuracy of the model. And the triangles that go like this is what happens if you pursue the same kind of high investment strategy in the context of the NEP. And this, to many historians and perhaps others, has seemed a more attractive development model than the one that was actually followed. Certainly in the period 1933, the NEP economy is doing much better than the actual economy because there's no catastrophic fall in farm output, associated famine, and so on. The populations are all larger here, though, right? And it doesn't do quite as well at the end as the collectivized economy, but then it avoids many, many millions of deaths that actually took place. So that's my favorite development trajectory out of these, but I'll leave it to you to decide. So I'm not a Stalinist after all. Yeah. GDP per capita. I can show you the population, but this is, but I'm not sure this is going to be very revealing actually, because the numbers are all scrunched together. But that's in the book, and I can't tell you. I don't have a slide. I'm sorry. But what do you want to know? Maybe if you ask me, I can tell you specifically what. Okay. Yeah.
For your last 1.5 minutes, can you tell us about what causes the slowdown? The slowdown is, maybe I'll give you a summary slide. So some of this is really cool. I'd like to show you the Soviet isoquant and how it works out with the model. This is a simulation, but partly it's a question of investment strategy. So I think there's a lot of investment that's wasted in the 1980s by being developing Siberian resources, which may have I say this, but now it all looks sort of different today. Maybe all the investment in the oil industry then was really very wise, right? Because it's the basis of your prosperity. But at the time I wrote this, it looked like that. A lot of that was a big misallocation of capital. There was a lot of investment in modernizing old factories that was also wasted. Now, I think that this is another area on which I think I have a different view than I did then. It seems to me that the way of organizing Soviet firms with output targets and soft budgets, while it may have made sense and been productive in 1935, was very inefficient and unproductive in 1985. One of the big structural things that had happened was the surplus labor economy was gone by 1985, right? And so the incentive structures that firms had were, they had no incentives to shed unproductive labor, and so that couldn't be reallocated to more productive activities. So one of the great virtues of capitalism is that it does close down unproductive facilities and frees resources for reallocation. So that wasn't taking place in the Soviet Union. And I think that I'm kind of impressed that the Chinese use market relations in conjunction with planning investment in a way that's much more efficient for this kind of reallocation of labor. Then I also do think that another feature related to the allocation of R&D resources that were excessively allocated to the military in the context of the Cold War, and that was inefficient from the point of view of developing production. And then finally, I think that dictatorship is not a system of social organization conducive to innovation, I would say. So quite how you want to factor out all of those, I don't have a simulation model to tell you their relative importance, but those strike me as important features. Okay, I think our time is up.